Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along and joining us on this Tuesday evening. My name is Professor Penny Bickle. I'm here at the University of York in our archaeology department. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker this evening, which is Julian Richards. Julian is, I'm sure, familiar to many of you for his broadcasting work, but he is an archaeologist and writer as well. He's worked on the theme of Stonehenge for a very long time, having written several really important guidebooks, including the current visitor's guide at Stonehenge. If you've been lucky enough to visit, you will have seen this. He's also very well known for his TV work as well, and one of the particular pieces of work that I'm very fond of that got me into archaeology in the first place is Meet the Ancestors, which was a really wonderful piece of TV. He's going to be here to talk to us today about his Stonehenge work and has just launched a new YouTube program trying to bust some of the myths that have developed around Stonehenge called Stonehenge Access All Areas. And we've got some flyers here for you to scan the QR code or pick up on your way out if you're interested in watching that. Otherwise, without further ado, Julian, I'll hand over to you for a talk for about 40 minutes and then we'll take some questions at the end. So over to you, Julian. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's just lovely to be back here in York for the Festival of Ideas. It's just such an absolutely wonderful series of events, and I'm not quite sure how I managed to keep getting myself invited back on a regular basis, but I'm very glad that I have been invited back. So this evening, I'm going to talk to you about something that's a little bit of an obsession of mine, Stonehenge. Anyway, Stonehenge, I mean, the great thing about talking about Stonehenge is no matter where you are, I think everybody knows the place. The last time I gave this talk was in a museum at Wanganui in the North Island of New Zealand a couple of months ago, and so you can talk about it anywhere in the world. Of course, what you can see from this, if I've got the pointer right, is the fact that everybody's obsessed with the stones in the centre. And basically, if Stonehenge didn't have those, it wouldn't get 1.5 million visitors a year. If it was just the earthwork, ditch and bank that you can see picked out incredibly well here in the snow, and the peripheral stones, it's those central stones that are what make it so special. And of course, what you can see in this as well, heading off into the landscape, is the line of the avenue here showing in the snow. Emphasising the point that it's not a monument in isolation. It does sit as part of a wider archaeological landscape. Now, here's me at my favourite monument with my favourite and probably most academic publication, the amazing pop-up Stonehenge, which I'm sure has given pleasure to many children and adults over the years. I've been involved with Stonehenge since 1980. At a time when I was willing to be photographed stripped to the waist, wearing skimpy denim shorts and shovelling out of a ditch that wouldn't be allowed for health and safety reasons these days. But that was the start of my involvement and fascination with this incredible place and the landscape that surrounds it. But of course, you have to ask the question, why is it so special? Well, of course, it's not the oldest megalithic monument in Europe. And by megalithic, I mean built out of big stones. So something that's big but made of a lot of small stones isn't megalithic. I'm sure many of you have been down to Carnac, Brittany, that sort of area, Gulf of Morbihan, seen some of the great menhirs and the tombs and the stone rows. This is the birthplace of megalithic architecture, effectively. And so what you see at Stonehenge is something that's actually very late in this megalithic sequence. It's also not the biggest, because the great rivalry in Wiltshire, of course, is between Stonehenge in the south and Avebury in the north, with people going, oh, Avebury's much better. Well, actually, no, it's not. Stonehenge is much better. But if you go to Avebury, some of the stones there, hang on a minute, wrong one. Some of the stones there, these weigh twice as much as the biggest stones at Stonehenge. You're talking about 100 tons plus here. So it's not the oldest, it's not the biggest. What it is, it's the most different in so many ways. Because when you stand in the entrance to that enclosure and you look towards the central stones, you're immediately struck by this sort of architectural quality to it. The fact that you've got regular spaced stones and you've got horizontal lintels. I mean, this is the reason why antiquarians in the 17th and 18th century were convinced that Stonehenge must be Roman in date. It was too sophisticated to have been built by the ancient Britons, who at that time were regarded as, crude savages who lived in holes in the ground. It had to be built by a more sophisticated civilization. Now, as somebody who feels that civilization in Britain ended in 43 AD when the Romans arrived, I obviously can't go along with that. So there is something incredibly different about it. There is no other stone circle in the British Isles where the stones are not local. Here you have two types of stone. The massive ones here, these are sarsens, a type of hard sandstone, the grains cemented with quartz, which come from a little further to the north. The smaller ones that you see here, these are some of the celebrated blue stones that come from the Preseli Hills in Wales. So immediately you've got the novelty of stones coming from a distance. And the temptation, until quite recently, has been to go to Avebury in the north of Wiltshire, because here you've not only got a vast stone circle, but if you've been there, every building is made out of fragments of sarsen. And if you look up on the Barbara Downs, quite close to there, up on Overton Down, you'll still see sarsens in their natural habitat. But recent analysis has shown that the source of the sarsens is actually further east, near Marlborough, at a place called West Woods, where despite centuries of destruction, and I mean the idea until the early part of the 20th century, they were breaking these stones up to use them as road metalling. And you sort of think, I wish I'd been there beforehand. But there are still stones in those woods. So we know that this is where the majority, not all, of the sarsens come from. So, of course, we now have to adjust our ideas about the route that they might have taken. And I was very lucky last year, myself and an experimental archaeologist called Luke Winter, we walked from West Woods to Stonehenge, trying to understand the thinking of the people that moved these massive stones 4,500 years ago. So that's the blue stones. Now, that's the sarsens. The blue stones, smaller. The pioneering archaeologist Sir Richard Hoare in the early 19th century very rudely called them the pygmy pillars, which I think is a bit dismissive because they do weigh up to about 4 tons. And the key thing about those is that they came from much further away. What you don't see today when you look at the stones is what the contrast would have been like when they were first worked, when they were first shaped. This is sarsen on the right, quite pale in colour, sort of slightly glistening. This is a piece of spotted dolerite, which is the most attractive of those Welsh blue stones, a sort of greeny grey colour with these wonderful white spots in it. So you would have seen that those blue stones were something very different. Now, until comparatively recently, the stones were first identified as coming from Wales by a geologist called Herbert Thomas in 1923, and he pointed to one of the outcrops as being this one in the top here, Carnminy, and also Carngodog, as being the source of some of these blue stones. More recent archaeological work, very, very detailed geological work by Rob Ixer and others, has demonstrated a number of sources of the stones within the Preseli Hills. And the one that I find most extraordinary is the one down at the bottom here, which is at a place called Craig Rosifelin, where not only can you tell that one stone at Stonehenge came from this area, but you can actually pinpoint the place on the rock face where that stone came from. The geology is so precise, and that's absolutely incredible. But that does introduce a question, which we'll look at a little bit, as to whether the stones came from there to a structure in Wales and were then moved, or whether they went straight to Stonehenge. So, of course, the route, now, who knows? This is where they started off, and this is where they end up. How they got there, whether it was entirely overland, at some point you probably have to cross a body of water here in the Severn Estuary, whether they were taken all the way round the coast, round Cornwall, we honestly don't know. Luke and I sat on the top of one of the hills in Preseli and had what effectively was an argument. Luke saying, I can see the sea from here. It makes entire logic to me. I'm sure the boat technology was there. And me going, no. Maybe because I get seasick, I don't know. But I decided that I'd probably try and take them overland and risk that short crossing over there. But the answer is we don't know. We know the origin, we know where they ended up, the exact route, it's still open to question. And then there's the altar stone. Now this is something that if you go into the centre of Stonehenge, is very difficult to see, because what you see basically is a little bit of stone buried underneath the ruins of the tallest of the trilithons. It's a slab, it's broken, and there's been a question in the past about whether it originally stood upright or whether it always was a slab on the ground. My feeling now is that it was probably always a slab on the ground because its long axis has a very precise orientation. Its origin, up until quite recently, has been a bit of a puzzle. People have tended to look towards Wales, but not the Preseli area. It didn't fit geologically. The Brecon Beacons was a suggestion. But again, recent geological work has demonstrated that it actually comes from the Orcadian Basin in the north of Scotland. Now, not Orkney. Everybody goes Orcadian. Oh, it comes from Orkney. No, it doesn't come from Orkney. It comes from a very broad geological area here in the north of Scotland that's known as the Orcadian Basin. And we can't precisely pinpoint where it comes from. Now, that is extraordinary. When this first came out, I was sort of sitting there thinking, how can I process this, that a 6-ton block of stone from the north of Scotland has ended up being incorporated in Stonehenge? You know, just the logistics of it, the idea behind it is just so extraordinary. When you go and visit that area, some things make sense, because this is an area where we find a class of prehistoric stone circle known as a recumbent stone circle, where, as well as a series of vertical uprights, we have recumbent stones. We have stones that lie flat on the ground. And when you actually look at one of these things, you sort of think, yes, I can see the whole idea of the recumbent stone. You know, that looks like the altar stone flanked by 2 bluestone pillars coming from here, as well as the geologically provenant stone itself. It still doesn't answer the question of how that stone actually got to Wiltshire, 500 miles away. This is just absolutely extraordinary. So the source, you know, the provenance of the stones in itself is quite remarkable, and the geology has really come on leaps and bounds in recent years. Now, the other thing is, if you go to any other stone circle in the British Isles, whether it's in Orkney or Cornwall or the Lake District or here at Rollright Stones in Oxfordshire, what you find are stones that have been selected, carefully selected. For example, at Avebury, they've been very careful to select vertical pillars and more lozenge-shaped stones and to juxtapose these with each other, but none of them show any signs of being shaped. They are all selected natural stone, natural slabs of rock. At Stonehenge, the stones are worked, they're shaped. This, you know, to me is the perfect example of this. That lintel is an astonishing piece of craftsmanship. Beautifully squared edges, perched on top of 2 huge uprights, and that has sat there for 4,500 years. The ditch and bank, about 3000 BC, the major reconstruction in stone taking place about 500 years later, towards the very end of the Neolithic. So, shaping the stones. And again, the only way you can do this is by chipping and pecking. And to achieve a shape like that and a surface like that, you're ending up at the end of it removing sand, effectively, by pounding with other pieces of stone. So the shaping is just extraordinary. The elements of Stonehenge, what you can see here are the uprights of the outer circle and these lintels that link them. Now, to be quite honest, if that was the only element of Stonehenge that survived, it would still be the most remarkable stone structure in the British Isles, because you've not only got shaped uprights, capped with horizontal lintels, another unique feature. But if you look carefully here, you can see that those lintels aren't straight, they're worked into a gentle curve. So what would have been suspended above the ground is a beautifully smooth ring of stone, not a series of short stones. But if that's not enough, the stones are jointed together by joints which really are found in carpentry. These are sometimes referred to as mortise and tenon joints. You know, they are location joints where on the top of each of these lintels, stone is removed to leave two protruding knobs or tenons which fit into corresponding hollows on the underside of the lintel. And then to make it even more unnecessary in some ways, because these stones would have sat there quite happily on their own, the ends of the lintels are joined together with what's effectively a tongued and grooved joint. I think one of the best descriptions came from a 7-year-old at a school I was talking to, looked at it and said, it's just like Lego, isn't it? And it is a bit, but it's Lego in stone that is harder than granite, which can only be worked by pounding it with other stone tools that was done 4,500 years ago. So not only have you got stones that are brought from a distance, they're shaped and then they're jointed together in this extraordinary way. You can see underneath the lintels, there's often a sort of shallow, what we call a tray, and hollows around some of the tenons as well. This, I suspect, is adjustment, because the surviving lintels of that outer stone circle are almost precisely level, even though Stonehenge is built on a slight slope. So the engineers behind this, and I use the term engineers because that's what they were, had a way of creating a perfectly level structure, you know, as well as everything else they were doing. Now, inside that is a circle of what I've already mentioned, the antiquarian archaeologist called the pygmy pillars. These are small, unshaped pillars of bluestone, not in their original position. These have been moved, and I'll explain a little bit about when the move took place and the significance behind this a little bit later. So we have a sarsen circle, we have a bluestone circle, and then inside that we have the first of the horseshoes of massive sarsen trilithons, 2 uprights and a horizontal lintel with the end of the lintel flush with the edge there and a very narrow gap between them. These are massive structures. The biggest one of them, the uprights weigh about 40 tons each and the lintel weighs another 10 tons. There's 90 tons of stone in it. This one fell over in 1797, and apparently the thud was felt in Amesbury, which is about 3 miles away, and was put back up again in 1958. Intriguingly, each of those trilithons has one upright that is very, very smooth and the other that's not worked to the same degree. Now this is, I think, an element of prehistoric thinking that's very difficult for us to get an understanding of. How can you get into the minds of the people that built this? What does it symbolise? Is it nature and art? Is one stone tamed, the other untamed? It has been suggested, not by me, I hasten to add, that it represents male, female. You know, that the slender, elegant one is the male and the slightly lumpier looking one is the female. Not my idea at all. But there is a thinking behind this. Every trilithon has got that juxtaposition of smooth and less smooth. And what's also amazing is that those trilithons graduate in height. They're laid out in a horseshoe, the open side of the horseshoe, the 2 shortest ones, 2 taller ones, and then at the back of the horseshoe, the only surviving upright of the tallest of the trilithons, the wonderful stone 56. So here's the only archaeological plan that I'm going to show you. It's actually, it looks a jumble, it looks a bit of a mess, but it's actually quite simple. We have that outer circle of sarsen uprights with its linked lintels, but notice an awful lot missing round this side. Inside that, we have our circle of bluestones. Then we have our horseshoe of trilithons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Inside that, a horseshoe of bluestones, this time more finely worked pillars, and there the wonderful enigmatic altar stone. So it's quite simple. Circle, circle, horseshoe, horseshoe, sarsen bluestone, sarsen bluestone. And I knew that I'd got the explanation right when my little friend Izzy, who's 7, watched my YouTube film and said to me afterwards, he said, I understand it now. It's circle, circle, horseshoe, horseshoe, sarsen bluestone, sarsen bluestone. And I thought, right, if a 7-year-old can understand it, I must have got the explanation right. So that's the structure. What we know about the sequence there comes from excavations that have taken place from 1901 onwards, because prior to that, people had dug holes in the centre of Stonehenge, usually looking for treasure. But the first excavation in 1901 was when the tallest stone was straightened up. Then Colonel Hawley in the 1920s did some very extensive excavations on this side of the site. Atkinson and Co. in the 1950s and 60s dug a lot in the centre. And so we understand the sequence from the results of those excavations. Gowland in 1901, very restricted, just around the base of that stone, very scientific, very organised, restricted himself just to this small area. His workmen here digging inside what he called his registering frame so that every object could be three-dimensionally recorded. The workmen here are sieving the soil to make sure they don't miss anything, and he promptly wrote his results up, concluding that this stone had been raised at the end of the age of stone and the beginning of the age of bronze, which he put at about 1800 BC at that time. He was spot on with the end of the Stone Age, beginning of the Bronze Age. We now know from radiocarbon dating that we're now talking about 2500 BC, a lot earlier, but he was absolutely spot on with that. Hawley was involved in work around the restoration of Stonehenge when it was given to the nation after the First World War, and also tasked with digging the whole of Stonehenge by the Society of Antiquaries. And I'm ever so glad that he ran out of steam halfway through, because it did mean that he left quite a lot of it for other archaeologists. And then Atkinson and Piggott's work, the biggest excavation was at the time that fallen trilithon was raised. And what this area that they dug here shows is the complexity of the below-ground archaeology. Not only the stone holes of stones that we knew had stood, holes for stones that had been moved or were missing, lots of timber post holes as well mixed in amongst it. Very, very complicated. And I have to say, sadly, not dug in the way that we would like it to have been dug, and also not published. And the key thing is, with archaeological work, you need to publish what you've done. And Atkinson apparently once said, excavation without publication is a crime against science. But he didn't practice what he preached, I'm afraid. So for a long while, a lot of the excavations at Stonehenge remained unwritten up until it was all collated together in the very late 20th century. And at last we had the results of these excavations, with a lot of gaps, I have to say. And then in 2008, the last excavation in the centre was undertaken by Tim Darvill and Jeff Wainwright, both now sadly not with us, which was trying to understand when the bluestones first arrived at Stonehenge, because this is a subject of still a lot of debate. When did those smaller stones actually arrive? Now, that's what you can see today, the ruins of the central structure. There are still a lot of questions there. We know that the ditch and bank were dug in around just after 3000 BC. We've got very clear carbon dating from antler picks found at the bottom of the ditch. Was there a timber phase? Because there are lots of post holes and you can sort of make patterns out of them, but Atkinson's assertion that there was a large timber building in the centre of Stonehenge before the stones cannot be borne out. And then we get the question of what was in the circle of 56 pits called the Aubrey holes that lie just inside the bank. Now, this is an illustration by Peter Dunn, reconstruction artist, who's brilliantly interpreted the results of the archaeological excavation. But those Aubrey holes, they are a puzzle. Did they hold timbers, or did they hold the bluestones in their first appearance at Stonehenge? And I don't think we can actually answer that question. This is Aubrey Hole 7 that was re-excavated in 2008. Not to try and answer this question, but because Hawley, when in his excavations, had excavated lots and lots of cremated human remains in the Aubrey holes and in the ditch and bank, and he didn't know what to do with them because the museum in Salisbury didn't want them. So in 1935, he and one of his colleagues re-excavated Aubrey Hole 7 and tipped them all back in. And these were re-excavated in 2008, which has given us an opportunity to analyse the composition of the cemetery, the cremation cemetery that developed at Stonehenge in its early stages. But this did not answer the question of what had stood in the bottom of that hole. There was no clear stone impression, as some people make out. And to be quite honest, for a pit that was dug in the Neolithic, dug in about 1920, redug in 1935, and re-excavated in 2008, that is not exactly pristine archaeological evidence. If anybody said, what would you like to dig at Stonehenge? I would like to go and dig an undisturbed Aubrey hole to try and answer this question once and for all. But nobody's going to let me, sadly. But that would maybe answer that question. So that is a puzzle. So did those stone holes hold the bluestones? I don't think we can actually answer that question. What we do know about the bluestones is that they do not stand now in their original position, because excavations, particularly by Hawley and by Atkinson in the centre, have shown that there's a peculiar, and to my mind, not very coherent arrangement. Paired stones in some places, in what are known as the Q and R holes. In other places, it looks like a single line. It lacks the coherence that I would have assumed we would have found with those stones. But what it obviously did incorporate, and what is very fascinating, is if you can see here, Peter Dunn has shown two little trilithons, two miniature trilithons. And those are based on evidence from two stones that have been found at Stonehenge. One excavated in the 1950s, which was sadly reburied. Look, it's a lintel. It's got mortise holes in it. And this stone, which now lies in the grass, which clearly stood as a pillar, there's a mortise hole. And if you know where to stick your fingers in the grass and the security guards aren't looking, there's another mortise hole just there. So we have two lintels of two presumably miniature bluestone trilithons. Now, where did those miniature trilithons stand? This is the question. Were they simply there as part of that early arrangement, or did they stand as miniature trilithons in a structure in the Preseli Hills? Because I've always felt this for a long while, that what came from Wales was not a collection of building material, but the components of a structure. Because if I was going to go to Wales to get stone, I would go and get spotted dolerite because it's the nicest looking stone. But there's a real mixture. Now, maybe this is because those stones had already been incorporated in something, they'd already got significance, and that was what was transported. Now, people have tried to look for the site of this original stone circle. Mike Parker Pearson, done a lot of work in the Stonehenge area and in Wales, was convinced at this place called Waimar that he had found the location of that stone circle. But I think even Mike has now rowed back on that idea, and really when you look at the evidence, it doesn't seem to stack up. And of course, if they took all the stones, and you're now looking for something that's got empty sockets, how do you find it in that rocky landscape? But this, I think, is a fascinating idea that that's what came. So if you look as well, I've already pointed out the fact that there's an awful lot of stones missing around this side. And it does beg the question of, was it ever completed? Now, there is a problem stone, this one, stone 11, which is in the right place to be an upright of that outer circle, but it's too small and always looks as if it's been too small. So was there another gap or entrance around that side? We have wondered whether there were actually stones there at all. The nicest stones around this side, the side, where I showed you that beautiful bit of the outer circle, these are the best worked, the finest tooled. They give the impression that this is the direction that Stonehenge is meant to be seen from. You're meant to look at it from that direction. And maybe round the back, they weren't, sorry, where's the thing gone? Maybe round the back, they weren't quite so bothered. They're smaller, they're more irregular. But there is evidence that the stone stood there, because in very hot summers, you see parch marks. You see the orange marks here? These are the parched out marks of stone holes. So there are clearly holes there that we're assuming held stones at some stage. Now, this is a very intriguing question. Now, as you're an intelligent audience, you will realise that dinosaurs died out a long time before Stonehenge was built. But it's a really intriguing question. How did they do it? Because basically, we don't have very much evidence. At the Stonehenge Visitor Centre, you will see a large fiberglass stone mounted on a sledge, mounted on rollers. A lot of debate about this. I've had no end of people telling me that they knew how it was done and have sent me ideas, most of which I think are not terribly feasible. But the answer is we don't know, because we simply haven't got the evidence. Because if you look at what's there, wooden sledge, ropes, levers, rollers, all of these things, all organic, they won't survive in a dry landscape. I've been involved in the only full-scale experiment 30 years ago to move a 40-ton block of concrete representing element of that tallest trilithon, and we did manage to do it on a sledge, which I wasn't terribly happy about, with about 130 people and the assistance of the 3 people pushing at the back. And I have got no idea what they really thought they were contributing to the effort of this. But of course, the thing about an experiment is that if it works, it doesn't tell you how it was done. It tells you how it might have been done. And, there's lots of suggestions. I'm very firmly of the opinion that to get the lintels up, they used, this is a little scale model Luke and I made, they used a sort of a crib of timber, a platform on which you move the lintel up. We don't know. We could do an experiment with this, it might work. And of course, this is something that's appeared in a lot of reconstructions in the past. Here from the guidebook, the one long before I wrote, back from the 1980s, a timber crib with a lintel on top of it. Now, an interesting idea. One thing I would point out is that we do know that Stonehenge wasn't actually constructed by Kirk Douglas. And that he wasn't assisted by Michael Heseltine and George Best. Ivan Lapper, the illustrator, liked putting real people into pictures. But what this is very intriguing, because what this illustrates is the desire to find some person who was responsible for the project. And it's often a rich person, somebody, buried in the area with obvious finery. And in fact, this person, Kirk Douglas, is based on Bushbarrow, the very, very rich early Bronze Age burial just to the south of Stonehenge, with all the regalia that person was buried with. So here there's clearly a suggestion that this was a person who was involved in it. And of course, this carries on, because this is the Amesbury Archer, incredibly rich beaker burial, very, very early beaker burial, not from that close to Stonehenge, buried on the other side of the river a few miles away. But when he was found, because of his wealth, there was this, again, suggestion, the king of Stonehenge, he's something to do with the builder of it. And because the isotopes from his bones suggested initially he was from German, we got tabloid headlines like this. Achtung, Great British Monument maybe. No, it wasn't. He wasn't anything to do with the building of Stonehenge. He was a bit too late, basically. But this suggestion of involvement by other sort of higher civilizations, carries on. What's very intriguing is if we're looking for the builders of Stonehenge, that a lot of really fascinating genetic work has gone on in recent years. And, it's a product of the indigenous late Neolithic population who are a mixture of early European farmer genetics and also, slight admixture from earlier Mesolithic Western hunter-gatherer cultures. But of course, you have got people like the Amesbury Archer appearing at this time. They are people from the continent bringing a new technology, a new method of burial, and they are having quite an extraordinary effect on the gene pool comparatively rapidly. They're looking different. They are maybe maybe introducing an element of plague. They're more successful in terms of their farming strategies. And what happens, to the people who had built things like Avebury and Silbury Hill, these massive late Neolithic monuments, as statements of their power and beliefs, within a couple of hundred years, there's an almost entire genetic replacement of that population by the incoming beaker genes, based on their sort of steppe ancestry. And I found that very difficult to understand how that could have happened over a series of about 8 generations. But this does seem to be the case. And what's fascinating at Stonehenge is that the rearrangement of the bluestones from the early arrangement to the circle and the horseshoe happens just about the time that this beaker replacement is taking place. So is this the incoming successful beaker population putting their stamp on this old monument? Rearranging the bluestones. They're not touching the Sarsens, they're a bit too big, but rearranging it. And then Stonehenge, unlike virtually every other site that starts in the Neolithic, carries on being used, modified, decorated by having daggers and axes carved on it a few centuries later. And the last bit of modification happens there in about 1500 BC, in the middle of the Bronze Age. So it carries on being a place of significance and central to massive Bronze Age cemeteries that develop around it. So, to me, those two things fit together. There's so much new research going on. It's just so fascinating. I'm aware I'm talking too much, but I'll hurry up. Why? Now, several suggestions. A place of burial, because I've already mentioned that it has all these cremations buried there, where Hawley excavated all of these Aubrey holes with red dots had cremations in them. So to Mike Parker Pearson, it's a place of the ancestors. It's a place of the dead. Now, that's fair enough. It is a cemetery. This is the excavation of Aubrey Hole 7 with huge quantities of cremated bones. We now know there's about 60 individuals. An isotopic study of those shows that some of them are not from around Stonehenge. They're from a different geology. And of course, the temptation is to go, are they from Wales? Because they do fit with that different sort of geology. And the other thing that Mike's Stonehenge Riverside project discovered was that Durrington Walls Henge, a couple of miles off to the east, was the site of a very large contemporary Neolithic settlement, tempting to see it as the place where the builders of Stonehenge in Sarsen were living. And that it was the houses that were found there are what the houses that have been rebuilt at the Stonehenge Visitors Centre are based on. So this idea that you have a domain of the ancestors, the place of the dead, and the domain of the living. This one represented by timber circles, this one represented by the stone circle. It's a very interesting idea. There's sort of slight problems with it chronologically, but you can't deny that Stonehenge is a cemetery. There's also the suggestion that came from the late Tim Darville and Jeff Wainwright that the bluestones are thought to have healing powers. This is why they were brought from Stonehenge, where there's a lot of folklore about water that flows over the stones and the healing power. And in fact, you find little standing stones next to springs. And that this is one reason why the bluestones were brought from Wales. Their excavation in 2008 was supposed to try and prove this idea. Very difficult to know how you prove it. How do you prove that people were breaking up blue stones to take away as talismans when you don't know the motivation behind breaking them up? And they also look to the Amesbury archer, who'd got a very bad leg, as being somebody who'd come looking for healing. I'm afraid that doesn't really work, and neither does the idea that all the Bronze Age burial mounds around Stonehenge contain people who were injured or diseased. We don't know because the antiquarians left the bones there. Interesting idea, but essentially unprovable. What we do know is that the structure contains a series of very important solar solstice alignments. The main one, the summer solstice, the winter solstice sunset, running straight through the centre, out through the entrance. But we've got solstice alignments going the other way, and also we've got a lot of lunar alignments that are now being recognised within the structure. And of course, a solar alignment, you can work that out in the course of a year. Anything lunar, you're talking about the lunar cycle, you're talking about 18 plus years of observing the movements of the moon. But it's quite clear that there's a lot more complex astronomy within Stonehenge than we first thought. At its basic level, midsummer sunrise off in the northeast, midsummer sunset in the southwest. To me, it's the winter. It's the turning of the year. It's the time when you have stored up your food for the winter. You're worried about the sun, which is getting lower and weaker. You want to know that there is a turning point at which the sun resumes its journey around the skies, which tells you that spring is coming and light and life. That's what, to me, it's all about. And when you look at other Neolithic monuments, Newgrange in Ireland, Maze Howe in Orkney, they only work at the midwinter. And even if you discount the idea that all the pigs that have been slaughtered at Durrington Wall settlement are all killed in the middle of the winter as part of big feasts, I think that it all points to it being the midwinter that's significant. But I don't think it's quite this simple. I think there's a lot more complexity built into it. When people go, it's this or it's this or it's that, I go, no, I'm sure that over the 1,500-year life of Stonehenge, its meaning may have changed. If you look at Salisbury Cathedral just down the road, it's a place where we can understand its orientation, that it was for Christian worship. It was a place where people came to look for spiritual and physical healing, where the wealthy came to be buried, where commerce was enacted. All of those functions are built into that 800-year-old building. I'm sure that Stonehenge's meaning changed over time. But of course, there is the suggestion now that what it is doing is it's a monument of national unity, because we've got the Sarsens from Leaby in Wiltshire, we've got the blue stones from Pembrokeshire in Wales, we've got the altar stone from the Orcadian Basin. You know, is it bringing people together? Is it uniting people? People involved in the transport, in the shaping of the stones, are they all bought into this extraordinary project? It's tempting to see it in that way, and I think particularly when we found that the altar stone came from so far away, that does leave support for that. And, you know, standing there by the side of that last summer and just thinking about it, you know, that to me, I think helps to explain it. There has been I'll just mention a couple of recent ideas. I don't know whether any of you picked up in the press about the fact that Stonehenge might be the scene of the Neolithic Olympics. Any of you picked up that one? To be quite honest, I'm used to quite strange ideas coming from quite strange people, but this one appears to have come from the current English Heritage Curator of Stonehenge, who suggests that there might have been a competitive element in this, and that people, you know, there were games involved and it was all to do. Now, I find that completely unfeasible. And I'd like to quote you something from Private Eye. Was Stonehenge a sports stadium? So when Private Eye start taking the mickey out of it, you realise. But also they have got a very, very serious point. Another theory advanced this week was that the true purpose of Stonehenge was to provide a lifetime's employment for future archaeologists who could come up with any old cobblers every week and keep us amused for thousands of years. So I'm not convinced by the Stonehenge Olympics idea, I'm afraid. I don't think it's anything competitive. Sadly, Luke Winter, the experimental archaeologist who's currently building a massive Neolithic hall at the Stonehenge Visitor Centre, was quoted out of context where he said, without being aware of this, that there is a natural human tendency to be a bit competitive. And we could imagine, I managed to bring a stone from West Woods and it only took me, 8 days, and I took 10. Yes, maybe there's that, but not that it's the Stonehenge Olympics, I'm afraid. And then the other thing is, on the subject of the altar stone, I don't know whether again you saw something, it's always claiming to have solved the mystery of Stonehenge. This is the theory by Dr. Remy Vennes, and one of the co-authors, who his team are suggesting that glaciers brought the altar stone to what is effectively now the North Sea, and which of course was dry land in the Mesolithic, and it ended up on what is now Dogger Bank, and that Mesolithic people decided to rescue this 6-ton stone in the face of rising seawater and move it to dry land, where it sat for several thousand years before being transported to Stonehenge. I find that, again, completely unfeasible. Why would a Mesolithic community rescue a 6-ton block of stone in the face of... And the idea that to consider the construction of Stonehenge might have started as a result of climate-induced migration. Sorry, I don't buy that one either. But what's fascinating is that new ideas, new data will always appear. People will always have new ideas. Some of them interesting, some of them unfeasible, but it's actually what makes Stonehenge so fascinating. And the fact that we will never, ever know everything about it. And I think that sense of enduring mystery, even in the face of all this science, is what, to me, makes it just such an extraordinary, wonderful place that we should all celebrate. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you. Oh. Oh.
Thank you so much, Julian. That was a wonderful introduction to the mystery that is Stonehenge. And we now have about 10 minutes for questions.
You've seen how so many land-based theories, you say, are unfeasible. And forgive me for asking this, but we'll get it out of the way. They said, with the film Disclosure Day coming out tomorrow and things, have you been contacted, or would you discount not just Stonehenge, but many monuments around the world of extraterrestrial involvement?
Yes, I think the very short answer to that, yes, I would. I do not hold for that they were constructed by aliens. So good, we got that one out of the way quickly. Right, next one, please.
At the back.
Thanks, that was a fascinating talk. You mentioned how you've been able to identify exact quarries where the bluestones came from, but there's still a big area that the altar stone might have come from. Is that just because you haven't been able to pinpoint it yet, or is there something about the geology?
No, I mean, this is obviously not work that I've done. There's a very wonderful team of geologists who've done this. I mean, it's just that in some cases, it's possible to identify an outcrop. And if you've ever walked around the Preseli Hills, I mean, there are some wonderful, spectacular outcrops. Some aren't that noticeable. But in that one case at Craig Rosyfelin, then because of the way the stratigraphy of the rocks, obviously it was like that, it'd been tilted up, you could actually tell the precise geological signature in that particular location of where a stone had come from. That is fascinating in itself because it maybe gives you an insight into how the stones were prized out of the rock face. But, really the significance of it is in identifying the individual locations and then wondering whether those give you hints about where, if there was a composite stone circle somewhere in that landscape, where you might go and look for it. Because, of course, if you've got stones from here, 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 and here, maybe you go and look in the middle. But this is ongoing work, and I'm convinced that somebody at some stage will find that missing stone circle location. But it wouldn't have been possible without this detailed geological work.
So you said the stones were worked. Do you know which tools they would have used to do that?
The only tools that you have got are the tools of stone. And so what was found in the excavation were a whole series of what we call mauls, which are round balls of the hardest sarsen. They've obviously chosen the hardest sarsen. And we suspect that they probably started off quite big and then they got worn down until they're the size of, an orange. The biggest maul hammerstone that's been found weighed 56 kilos. Now that is a huge ball of sarsen, which they must have actually either put it in a sling and bashed the stone again. You couldn't pick that up and pound it, but that is the only tools that you've got, because of course there's no metal at this time, and the first metals which come in shortly after this are copper and gold, neither of which are very useful for working stone that's harder than granite. So it is just literally pounding away with other bits of stone. So that's all they had. Yes, gentleman here.
Yeah, who determines which archaeologists get to work there and what they're going to do when they are there?
Well, I mean, the thing is, it's under the guardianship of, Historic England as a protected site. Unfortunately, there's been quite a sad history of excavation in the past, of people digging it and not writing things up. And I think at the moment, there's still outstanding reports that need to be prepared, both within the landscape and at Stonehenge itself. And until all that is done, then I don't think there'll be any consideration. I don't know. I'd be interested if somebody did suggest, because this is one of the real burning questions, is what do the Aubrey holes hold? And the excavation of a fresh one would possibly answer that question. I don't think that I will live long enough to actually see that happen, sadly, because I did get to work on the re-excavation of the Aubrey hole in 2008, which is the only time I've actually dug at Stonehenge itself. But that's the one thing I would really like to do. But it's not going to happen anytime soon, I'm afraid.
Is there any theory as to why this particular spot was chosen for such an elaborate monument?
Oh, the why is Stonehenge where it is. In broad terms, what environmental study has shown us over the years, Dr. Mike Allen, somebody I work with quite a lot, has demonstrated that this particular area and one or two areas within Wessex, after the last glaciation and all the regeneration of woodland and things, never became densely wooded. Because when I was at university, I was told that the whole of the British Isles was just thick forest and that, Neolithic farmers had to come in and chop woodland down. They didn't in that area. It stayed as almost sort of Arctic tundra-like scrubby grassland, which of course would have been very attractive to early agriculturalists and herders. Cranbourne Chase, Stonehenge area, Avebury area all seem to have stayed like that. Why that precise location is actually more difficult to say. There was a suggestion up until quite recently that the heel stone, which I didn't mention, which is an unworked sarsen that stands near the entrance, might have been a very rare natural sarsen within that landscape, because there are some smaller sarsens, but that's been shown recently to have come from West Woods. So that doesn't work. And the line of the avenue has been suggested as following some natural periglacial geological stripes, which happen to line up precisely with that solstice alignment. Now, if there was something in the landscape, that natural feature that pointed something like that, that may help to explain it, but we don't know. And of course, in its early form, it was just a bank and ditch with a series of cremations, which is not, well, it's unusual, but it's not unique. It's why it then became enhanced in this massive way with this complicated stone structures that's actually more difficult to understand. But we don't really know why that spot.
I got very excited when you said about Orcadian Basin, because I wanted to ask about the Nessa Brodga, and I might have my timelines completely mixed up, but is there any sort of contact or influence, or does it make you look at Stonehenge in a different way, given all the archaeology that's been found in the Orkneys?
This is probably not a question to try and answer in very, very shortly. There has always been this tendency, I think, until quite recently, to see, places like Orkney as being, far north, very remote, and any influences have come from the south up there. It's now obviously the other way round. So we can see, for example, pottery styles that develop in Orkney, then spread their way down south. And of course, when you look at things like that, that implies the contact of people, the contact of ideas, and maybe this is where something like, the transport of the stone started. So there isn't any direct, correlation, but I think there's a lot going on in Orkney which actually spreads out further south. And as I've said, Stonehenge is actually very late in the megalithic sequence in Britain, and even more unusual in that it carries on for very long after it was first constructed.
Okay, we're going to have one last
more
question, which is right
up to the back.
Someone heading up, the steward is heading up to you up the stairs.
Yeah. If you, as I say, I'm dreadful at plugging this series of films because we do answer a lot of the questions, but also in the autumn at the Wiltshire Museum in Devizes, partly as a fundraiser for the museum, I'm going to give what will probably be the longest continuous lecture about Stonehenge. I'm going to start at 10 o'clock in the morning, and my friends reckon that I can go for at least 12 hours. Solidly, taking only short toilet breaks, talking about Stonehenge. This will be live streamed. So
fantastic!
If you're really obsessed with the idea of it, then tune into that. You can go to sleep, obviously, halfway through it. But yes, anyway.
Hello. Yes, very broad question, but do you think AI either has or will throw light on some of these mysteries you've expounded on?
You want a short answer? No. Because the thing is, AI depends on what goes into it in terms of what comes out. And I mean, I have to say, at the moment, there is an awful lot of what my friends who know a lot more about this call AI-generated slop on the internet. People just feed stuff in and it churns stuff out. So I personally, I mean, maybe it's me, my age, and the fact that I hate the whole idea of it. Friends of mine use it for analysing data, sifting out ideas. But this idea that it's suddenly going to reveal things, I'm not convinced at all. Are you? I mean, you're working at a university, so I don't. But I'm a firm believer in human intelligence rather than artificial intelligence.
It might enable calculations on alignments and things.
Oh, but I mean, a lot of that's been done already without the use of AI. I mean, people have used a lot of predictive models and terrain modelling and all sorts of things to work these sort of things out. But as I say, it all depends on the data that you've got to start with. AI can't generate information; it can just sift through and maybe throw up new ideas. But maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm just too old to accept it.
No. Well, there's a very famous archaeologist misquoting the Shakespeare quote, saying every generation gets the Stonehenge it deserves.
Oh, yes.
And so
Jaquetta Hawks. Yeah.
Maybe that's coming for us. I want to end, before I say a vote of thanks to Julian, by saying you're going to be here to sign books for a little while longer, with our festival bookseller, Fox Lane Books, outside. So if you did want to ask Julian another question and get a copy of his Stonehenge book, we'll be there for a little bit longer. Otherwise, please take the time to check out more of our programme for Festival Ideas. And also what's been available online, as I believe in, not only do we have Access All Areas Stonehenge from Julian, which I strongly recommend you check out, but we also have the festival programme online as well. And with that, I want to say a huge thanks to Julian for coming along and telling us all about Stonehenge this evening.